The story of Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh tells of one of the greatest scientific feuds of history. Through the course of their battle, they discovered hundreds of dinosaur species and redefined American science. In the process, nearly destroyed both of them. The story begins with the birth of Othniel Charles Marsh in a poor farmhouse in New Hampshire. He was expected to have little future, but his rich uncle, George Peabody, funded his education at Yale, where he later went on to teach in the science department. Marsh then left the university so he could spend more time in the field researching his beloved dinosaurs. That is where he met his lifelong enemy, Edward Drinker Cope.
Cope, on the other hand, had a very bright future. He had the support of a rich Quaker family, and by a young age was already creating detailed drawings of lizards and other vertebrate animals. At a young age, Cope attended the University of Pennsylvania and assisted in the excavation of the second full dinosaur under the acclaimed Joseph Leidy. As both scientists progressed in the field of paleontology, they became aware of each other. They started off as acquaintances, but they soon began to dislike each other. In another incident, Cope had worked for several months and finally reconstructed the Elasmosaurus, a monster of the sea. He believed this to be a short-necked and extremely long-tailed beast, but when inspected by Marsh and Joseph Leidy, it was determined that, in fact, the neck was long and the tail was short. Cope had placed the head of the beast on the wrong end. Cope took this as a personal insult, and from then on, despised Marsh. At this time, Marsh was jealous of Cope's brilliance, and therefore dedicated himself to finding every imperfection in Cope's work. In 1873, Marsh was appointed the first professor of paleontology at Yale College. This opened up many opportunities for Marsh, and he led one of the first major paleontology expeditions out west. Out west, Marsh and his crew went through many heroic adventures, from hostile Indians to poisonous snakes. Marsh, being the opportunist that he was, made absolutely sure that all of these adventures made headlines back east. With this expedition, Marsh had not only advanced paleontology, but also staked out his claim to the bone fields of the West. He would not be willing to share with anyone, especially Cope. In 1878, the several branches of the surveys consolidated. The expedition Marsh worked for ended up leading the survey, and Marsh came out on top, leaving Cope without funding. Cope had to rely on his inheritance for funding, selling his house and his bone collection. In the end, Marsh was exposed for fraud. He lost all of his dinosaur bones and was fired from his position as the National Geological Survey. Cope, too, lost all his credibility. He went completely broke and was forced to sell all of his dinosaur bones. But shortly after, tragedy struck. Cope died in 1897 at the age of 56. Marsh died 2 years later, in 1899.